So I'm Peter. I'm here to share with you some ideas on how learning really works, and that it's not what you think. So normally I work in leadership development for companies, executive coaching, written a few books, that sort of thing. But I'm also a trustee of the trust, so I've got a personal vested interest as well in supporting you and helping you to get more out of your work, as well as make the difference that I know you're all keen to make. So it's great to be here from that point of view as well. I just want to start off with some kind of basic background on how you as a human being are built. So first of all, Genome. You'll be familiar with the Genome. It's not a song by Dex's Midnight Runners. It's your DNA. You know about that. You know that your genome is unique. That the instructions, a set of instructions, the long sequence of molecules that contains the instructions to make a copy of you, is unique. Anybody got an identical twin? No? If you've got an identical twin, they might have an identical copy of the same genome. There probably will be some mistakes in it, because that's what happens when DNA gets copied. And that's why we have this infinite variety of life on Earth and this wonderful variation within a single species, which is us. And it makes us resistant to things like diseases and problems that arise from the copying process. So the genome is unique. It's the instructions to make a copy of you. And the next step up from genome is called phenome. Your phenome is the physical expression of those instructions to make you. And obviously it's all very well having the instructions to make you, but we've got to make you out of something. And so everything that you've eaten and drunk and breathed in your life is part of your body. You are literally what you eat. So you sit here now, your cells, physically constructed using the instructions of the genome from the molecules that were contained within all the cheeseburgers and Chinese takeaways and stuff that you've eaten. And that makes a copy of you. And your phenome is unique. There's nobody in the world who looks exactly like you. And two identical twins won't look exactly the same, because the instructions in the genome never get turned into the physical form perfectly. And also, it depends on what sort of resources and raw materials are available. If we had two genetically identical twins and they were separated at birth for whatever reason, and they have very different environments and diet, we would expect their bodies to be a little bit different. It's a bit like when you buy some seeds from the garden centre and you plant them, and it says on the back of the packet it will grow to 1 metre. A bit. It might do. They might grow more, they might grow less. They might not grow at all. It depends on what you do with them, what raw materials you give them, that the plant's going to build itself out of. Same with you. And one of the really important things from our point of view about the phenome is that includes the brain. So the brain is a very specialised organ. Looks a bit like this. Obviously you know where the brain is, and maybe you heard in the keynote earlier today that Einstein's brain was no different to anybody else's. Almost true. It was about the same weight and the same size, but in later years, developing better technologies to look inside a brain, we're able to see in certain areas it's more richly connected than perhaps an average brain. And that's the important part, because on top of the phenome, which is a default copy of you, fresh out the box, like getting a new phone, doesn't do anything when you first switch it on, just asks you to put your name and all that sort of stuff in. And then you start putting apps on, you start learning to get it to do useful things. So the physical brain, the phenome that the brain is part of, the brain is, like all the other organs in your body, it has cells in it that are specialised to do a certain job. Like the cells that are in your lungs are specialised to get gases to and from your bloodstream, oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. And the connections in your brain, or the cells in your brain, are specialised to do a certain job. So cells in your brain are called what? Not a trick question.
Brain cells.
Brain cells, yes. Otherwise...
engage our brain cells.
Now that is, of course, the technical term. The layman's term, or another name for them, is neurons. You've all heard that. You all know that. Don't know why I'm asking. You all know the answer. Anybody know how many neurons there are in the human brain? Approximately. Not trillions. Good guess. There are trillions of something. 100 billion, very good guess. It's 90 billion, roughly, in every human brain. But what does change from brain to brain is the number of connections, and you're right, that's in the trillions. Because, how many neurons? 90 billion neurons in a brain, but each of those neurons will connect with between 10 and 10,000 other neurons, giving rise to trillions of connections. More neurons in the brain than there are stars in the observable universe. It is the most complex structure that we know of. And you're all the custodians of that, both your own and the ones that you're working with, of course. And it's the connectivity that's the important part. And that connectivity is what we call your connectome. So your genome is the instructions to build a phenome, your body, and in the phenome then adapts to the outside world, to the environment. And when your brain adapts to the outside world, it builds a map of connections called the connectome. The connectome is the network of connections, which is a literal map of your life experience. Your brain is a literal physical map of everything that you've experienced in your life that makes you who you are today, and could make you somebody different tomorrow if you chose to be. So the connectome is the bit that makes you you. It's the bit that contains all the rules about your behaviour, all your knowledge, everything that you know, every song that you can sing along to when you're drunk, everything that you've ever experienced in your life is in the connectome, is in the physical map, in the wiring of your brain. And for a long time, a holy grail, really, in terms of sort of neuroscience of learning, has been about increasing the efficiency of transferring knowledge. And there's lots of experiments being done about this, and there's lots of stuff that shows up in science fiction as well. George Lucas's first film in 1971, THX 1138. Anybody heard of it? Yeah, it's. It's not gripping viewing, but it's one of the first sort of dystopian future sort of sci-fi stories, and about these people who want to escape from this dystopian society where everybody's controlled. And so one of the characters, Donald Pleasance, is escaping. He comes across a school, and the school is just kids running around playing, but they've got these tubes plugged into their arms. These ones are advanced economics. And Donald Pleasance is saying, oh, when I was your age, primary economics was a bottle this big and it took a week to go into your eye. So that's that was the vision of fast learning, transfer of knowledge back in the 60s. Of course, more recent, I'm sure many of you have seen a film called The Matrix, in which knowledge is transferred into a brain via a kind of an electrical connection. And you've seen how people will need a certain skill to do a certain thing, fly a helicopter, and that knowledge gets uploaded into their brain. Some interesting experiments have been done. Mice in mazes, this is a common thing that psychologists and neuroscientists research for investigating learning. So there was a mouse that learned its way around a maze, and it had a little bit of silicon with some artificial neurons on, put into its brain. It learned its way around the maze, and then they took that silicon out, which was bad for that mouse, put that into a brain of another mouse, and the second mouse also now knew its way around the maze. So they were able to transfer knowledge from one brain physically directly into another. There's been research done with mapping the connections in the brain, mapping the connectome. So they took a worm, only 340 neurons in its brain compared to your 90 billion, sliced it up in order to be able to see where the neurons were connecting to. Because those 90 billion neurons that I mentioned, each of those 90 billion neurons is connected to between 10 and 10,000 other neurons. So the density of the connections is just mind-boggling. There are more neurons in your brain than there are stars in the observable universe. That's how complex, it's the most complex structure that we know of. And we're on the inside of it trying to understand it, and this is kind of where we've got to. So they sliced the worm's brain up, and they represented the connections between neurons as rules in software, because each neuron can switch another one on or off. And if you've got 10,000 inputs into one neuron, switching some on, some off, that's partly how you're making very complex decisions that you make. So they then put that into the software of a robot, switched the robot on, and the robot started behaving like the worm. Purely from transferring the physical structure of the worm's brain into the software of the robot, without trying to get the robot to do anything, just to emulate the structure. The robot moved towards food and away from light. Now you might think, well, that's trivial. You've got probably robots in the school that you could program to do that in 5 minutes. You can program that in 5 minutes when you know what you're doing and you know what it is you want it to do. But reproducing the structure to see what emerges from that is a whole different ballgame. There's a guy called Steve Grand, who's an artificial intelligence researcher. He set about to make, in his basement of his house, an artificial orangutan. He didn't get very far with it, but what he discovered along the way, his approach was to understand everything that we knew about neuroscience and the workings of the brain, to build that physically in an electrical and mechanical system, and to be able to get that artificial orangutan to point at a banana. It doesn't sound very exciting, but it's a tremendously complicated thing to be able to do. As I say, he didn't succeed in that, but he learned a lot along the way, and his book, Growing Up with Lucy, is a tremendously engaging account that there's a lot of this neuroscience research is condensed into. And there's a company in America, of all places, that when you die will freeze your head at the moment of your death, with the aim that at some point in the future this technology will have advanced to the point where your brain, your connectome, can be derived from the physical structure of your brain and either put into software so you can live in some sort of software environment like the Matrix, or you can maybe live on in a robot body, which, sounds pretty cool to me, or maybe even transferred into another mind, maybe one cloned from your own body. And what we know, because we can do this through 340 neurons, what we know is that doing it with 90 billion neurons is no longer a matter of technology, it's only a matter of time. And so, for now, this idea of transferring knowledge from one mind to another, all of that technology might be here in decades to come, but right now we are utterly, as a species, reliant on you. Your job, the task you're faced with, is to take the entire body of knowledge of the human race and transfer that into the minds of the generations to come who are going to preserve and protect this planet that we live on. So, no pressure. But that's fundamentally what you are doing, because right now the technology doesn't give us any other way to pass on this immense body of knowledge and of learning that's been amassed over the millions of people that have lived. So how did all this knowledge get in there? It's all through the magic of timing. Timing is critical to everything. Fundamentally what happens is some stimuli, some event, something happens, something disturbs the outside world. My larynx is disturbing the air and causing shock waves through the air that are arriving at your ears. So stimuli is presented to your sensory systems. Any events which are coincident in time become connected within the brain. Most of that gets forgotten again when you sleep, but anything that's novel and useful gets retained within the structure of the brain. And this has been known about for 70 years or so at least. A guy called Donald Hebbian theory, he noticed that when neurons were stimulated together, they would spontaneously, the cells in a dish, would spontaneously grow connections and connect up with each other. A bit later on, a couple of decades later, with more advanced measurement equipment, we're able to see that it isn't neurons that are firing at the same time, it's firing just slightly one before the other. So when one nerve fires before another one, they will connect together on the assumption that one caused the other, one event caused the other. And that's called spike timing dependent plasticity. Spike as in the electrical signal spiking. Timing dependent, it's about the precedence of the signals. Plasticity meaning the brain physically changes its structure based on what's presented to your senses. And so neurons spontaneously interconnect based on the timing of incoming signals, And then there's a part of your brain right down at the bottom of the brain called the hippocampus that has the job of creating action replays, and these action replays allow the brain to adjust to unfamiliar events, unfamiliar input. Hippocampus is that bit right down in the bottom there. Most things in the body are named after either who discovered them or what they look like. Hippocampus, as in Latin for seahorse. Nobody knew what it did. It was shaped like a seahorse, so we'll call it hippocampus because that sounds better than calling it seahorse. Sounds like we did some actual research. But now we know what it does. Or we kind of know how it's connected, and from that we infer what it does. This is a video of neurons connecting to each other. So these are neurons on a slide under a microscope, and you can see they are physically reaching out, trying to connect with each other when they are stimulated, because that's what neurons do. That's all that they do. Interesting, isn't it? So your brain, is essentially a decision-making system. It's an extraordinarily complex decision-making system, but then that allows you to make very complex decisions, like what to have for lunch. Are you on a diet or not? Or you've said that, or you're going out tonight, maybe. All of these different factors that you're able to take into account very, very quickly. So what you're doing is you're taking information through your senses about external events that are going on, and remember that map of connections in the brain, the connectome, is a physical map of everything you've experienced in your life up to this point. So whatever's happening on the outside is being compared to what you have already experienced, what you already know. So how many of you have had the experience so far today, maybe in the keynote or maybe in one of the other workshops, where somebody said something and you thought, oh, I already knew that. Oh, I'm already doing that. I saw people nodding, I heard people saying this during the keynote. And how many of you have had the experience of hearing something and thinking, oh, that's not true, I don't believe that, oh, that's not my experience, that sort of thing. Because that's this process going on. You're comparing what's new and unexpected to what you already know, what you're familiar with, thinking about it. I'll explain what that means in a minute. You're reacting to it. You're having emotional reactions. You're gearing up to do something, and then you generate behaviour. And anything that you do that results in behaviour changes the outside world. So me talking to you is changing the outside world because I can hear the sound changes in sound pressure coming back in through my ears. So I can hear myself talking, and I'm modifying what I'm saying based on what I can hear. So we're living in this constant ongoing feedback loop, which is modifying the outgoing behaviour based on what's then been received back through the sensory systems. And occasionally updating the thinking that is leading to those behaviours. But only very occasionally. It takes a lot for people to change their minds about things. How many senses do we have? 6. That was a better answer than 5. Last count, about 22, 23. Totally distinct sensory systems. Sensory receptor that is attuned to doing one job and one job only. A nerve pathway that links it back to a primary processing cortex within the brain, an area of the brain that relates and integrates that sensory information into this overall experience that we call life or reality or whatever name you have for it. And the brain can acquire, because it's plastic, can acquire new senses. So, for example, there was an interesting bit of research done. They made these belts that had 8 little boxes on, and each box had in it a GPS compass and a little buzzer like the one you've got in your mobile phone. And whichever box was pointing north, that box would buzz and the person would feel it on their skin. After a few days, the volunteers stopped feeling the buzzing. After a couple of weeks, they could navigate around a maze blindfold. In an MRI scanner, they could see that their brains had changed structure, had developed a new sensory area for processing this information from this device that had been attached to them. So the brain had physically reorganised around the presentation of new information. Bit of research done back in the 1960s. They got an old, one of these huge TV cameras, if anybody's old enough to remember the old opening scenes of Blue Peter, you'd normally see one there, these massive things. And they hooked it up to this bit of electronics that would simplify the image down to a 4x4 grid of either black or white squares. They hooked that up to the back of a chair. And in the back of a chair were 16 4x4 grid of these things called solenoids. Anybody know what a solenoid is? It's just it's basically a magnet within a coil, and when you pass electricity through the coil, the magnet moves. And so if the square from the TV camera was white, it would give the person in the chair a little tap in the back in that position, and if black, it wouldn't. And after a few weeks sitting in the chair, there was one guy in particular who knew when somebody had walked into the room, could see who it was, and whether or not they were wearing a hat. Now you might think, 4x4 grid, 16 pixels, that's ridiculous. You can never see that amount of detail. That's true. But if you get a little, look through a toilet roll tube or something, at a huge painting, and you move that around, and you have a way of remembering what you've seen so far, you will build up a very detailed map of what's out there using a very low resolution sensor. Your eyes, resolution of your eyes, is not that great. I think I remember reading about a megapixel, something like that. If you saw a megapixel phone, you go, oh, I'm not having that, it's rubbish, it's an old thing, I want 50 megapixels, because I need them all. So the brain, the eyes are constantly moving, and the brain is building up this visual map of what's outside, and that's just the visual sense. This is going on with all of your senses. So the brain is building new sensory systems to relate more effectively with the outside world, because the outside world is changing. So this is a slice down through the brain. If we sliced a human brain in half, we would see that it was made up of 6 physically distinct layers. And in these 6 layers, we have connections between neurons running up and down through the layers, and also side by side in each layer. And what happens is, when the sensory input comes along, it's presented into this connectome, into this map of connections. And the map of connections sort of activate each other, and that electrical signal works its way through until it pops out the other end as a motor output. And if that input, if that sensory experience is new, novel, unexpected, then there are no connections for it to follow. So what happens is it goes all the way up to the top layer, the neocortex, this wiggly bit on the outside, which is very big. It's wiggly because it's folded up to make the surface area bigger. Where some thinking takes place. Oh, this is weird. Oh, I don't know what this is. What's happening? What do I do about this? And oh, this reminds me of this other thing. And oh, this is a bit like this. And I'm going to try this. And then the signal comes all the way back down the other side to the motor output where behaviour is generated, and behaviour changes the outside world, and then we go round and round in circles. Now, this layer here just saw, if I can use that terminology, just saw a signal go that way and a signal come back down that way. They passed each other by within a certain time window. So this layer is going to think, those signals that passed each other by, they seem to be connected. And so cross-connections at that layer will spontaneously form just because of the timing of those signals. And now, the next time you experience that sensory input, the path it takes through your brain will be shorter. And then it will get shorter. And then it will get shorter. Up to the point that you're now able to react from habit, you're now able to react fast, but you can no longer think about it. So if you've learned something like learning to drive or learning a sport or something physical like that, first of all it feels a bit clumsy, a bit awkward because you have to think about it. This is flexible but slow. And then over time you seem to develop a different way of learning, different way of thinking about it. Some people call it muscle memory. It's the connections are now existing much lower down in the brain, which means the reaction is faster, it's automated, but it's now outside of your conscious awareness. Which means once we've learned something, learned a reaction to something, we can react fast, but we can't change it without help. It becomes very difficult to change, but if you know how to change it, it becomes it's possible, is what I'm saying, but difficult for a person to do themselves. And then the hippocampus is sitting here, replaying this sensory input over and over and over again in order to program these cross connections. And so I'm guessing, so for example, I was in the keynote session just before lunch, and certain ideas, certain things were being said, and as I kind of looked at the people in the audience, some people were going, oh, we already do that, I already do that, I do that. Anybody here thought that already today. I already do that. I already do that. Yeah, I already know about that. So this new experience that you're having, never heard this person speak before, is being compared to what you already know. And then there was some stuff that was different to what you'd thought. So when you heard something today that's different to your experience or different to what you thought, how did you react to that? Did anybody think, oh, that's not true? That's not my experience.
Give it more thought.
You think, oh, yeah, that's weird. I don't need to think more about that. So you might feel curious, perhaps, intrigued, maybe surprised, maybe, that's rubbish. I didn't spend years. I haven't been told this. You might feel offended by it. But the point is, you feel something about it, and what you're feeling about is the difference between the outside information that's being presented to your senses and the inside information, the lifetime of experience in the connectome that's telling you how the world is supposed to be. And the hippocampus is building these connections by repeating, by providing these action replays of anything that is new, novel, unexpected, different to how you know the world is. So constantly what your brain is doing is comparing new information from the outside world with what you already know and expect about the outside world, how you expect things to be, and if there's a deviation, a difference, the hippocampus is replaying that so that you can integrate that difference into the connectome, so the next time round you can be better positioned to react, which is a very important survival process. Anybody, you know loads of different learning theories and models. Anybody come across Kolb? Experiential learning theory, yeah. And a lot of people look at Kolb and say, that's the learning cycle. And you use it to plan reflection time, and you plan an experience, like an experiment or something. What I would suggest is, don't think about Kolb as a model of explicit intentional learning. Don't think of it as a way of writing a lesson plan. Experiential learning theory, which I'll recap if you haven't come across it, it's a commentary on the ongoing cycle in every second of your life of integrating new experiences, novel experiences, into the connectome, the map of your life experience. So concrete experience, what we can't say there's a first part of the cycle, but concrete experience here. Concrete experience for you right now and for your learners is happening all the time, whether you like it or not. You don't get to control concrete experience. It's happening. You giving them an experiment or a practical activity, that's just a different concrete experience. The concrete experience is already there. Reflective observation is what the hippocampus is doing, looping back anything that's novel. The abstract concept is, I know why that didn't work. I know what I should have done. I know what it's supposed to be. It's forming that kind of theory and planning ahead, and then the active experiment is, right, next I'm going to do it this time. Next I'm going to hold the handle down. If that doesn't work, I'm going to hold there we go. So this is happening in seconds. And always the reference point for the new experiences is the existing map, the existing life experience. Always takes precedence over anything that's happening outside. So the map is creating the filter for interpreting new experiences. And what you will tend to do is focus on the information that proves what you already know. Psychologists have known about this for years. They call it confirmation bias. This is why we have confirmation bias, because your existing map gives you your feelings of security and psychological safety. Knowing how the world is supposed to be means you can then navigate effectively through the world and achieve the things that you want to achieve, which is very, very important for our survival. One thing I've discovered working with people over the years is that, as a general comment, human beings would rather be right than be happy. We would rather prove that we know how things are than have things how we would really like them to be. So learning is continual and automatic. We cannot prevent learning from taking place. The best we can do is to influence what is taking priority, what is in focus, what is being learned at a particular point in time. And we can learn about learning because of this reflective process. I mean, right now we're learning about learning. We can even spend time learning about learning. Because we have this ability to self-reflect and self-observe and compare information at higher and higher levels, we have the ability to learn that learning is fun, or boring, or interesting, or useful, or whatever. And we're going to bring that experience into anything that we label as learning. Just, as I said, I do a lot of work with companies. I'm a call centre company. A few times a week brings people off the call centre desks into a training room. And because they've got the training room set out to look like a classroom, a lot of people working in that call centre, it's their first job after school. You put them in a room that looks like a classroom, what are they going to do? They're going to behave like they're in a classroom. One of the biggest problems they had was learner engagement and getting people's attention and getting people to take stuff. What do you expect? You make it look like an environment which is going to trigger certain responses, because those were the sensory stimuli that were coincident when that learning was taking place. So if we want to change that, we change something in the environment. So this is all very well and good. I'm sure you're all very intrigued and thrilled and entertained by my presentation so far. But what you really want to know is what? How to use it, right.
How does it relate to people?
Yes! What you want to know. You're all jumping into active experiment. You want to know, what do I do with it?
It was mine. We all know it was.
Where do I get my electrodes from to put in people's brains? What happens? So I'm going to give you just 3 or 4 minutes, just as we wrap up, to talk to the people next to you. What I want you to do is I want you to get into long conversations, evaluating ideas and coming up with plans and so on. I want you to list as many ideas as you can, thinking about things that I've talked about in this session, maybe things you've heard in other sessions. What ideas does that spark that are worthy of future discussion with your colleagues? So I don't need to come up with any fully formed plans right now. Focus on the quantity of ideas. You might think about physical environment, because that's always there, and it's part of what's being learned, whether you think it is or not. You might think about the meaning of learning, the meaning that we put on difference and unexpected events. You might think about emotional state of learners. That becomes part of learning because it's coincident with whatever's going on. You might think about purpose, past experiences that you are either building on or struggling against. And you might think about judgments that you place on things like right, wrong, success, failure, which don't mean anything outside of the frameworks that you put around them. So there's some things you might think about. And I'd like to, just for the next 3 or 4 minutes, come up with as many ideas as you can with the people around you, that things that I've talked about, that you've heard elsewhere, that spark further conversation, further discussion with your colleagues. Give them time to let the hippocampus do what it does and let that process do its thing. Have any of you ever had something happen to you that was quite dramatic and unexpected, like a car crash or something like that? And after the car crash, did you experience flashbacks? Did it kind of run through you? Anybody here had an argument with somebody, and afterwards it kind of goes through your mind again and again and again. And I should have said this, and you should. This is the thing. This is what it's doing. I had a head-on crash in 2000. Not that serious really, but it comes as a big surprise when the car comes round the bend on your side of the road. And my brain would replay a little 2-second sequence of the mental movie every few minutes for a few weeks until it sort of gradually died down and went away. That's the hippocampus preparing me to make rational decisions next time I'm in a similar situation. And we've got to let that process do what it's there to do. Tremendous ideas that you've come up with, and I'm sure you've all come up with many, many more. And please keep talking about it, because in trying to show you and share with you just a little bit in half an hour of how learning really works, and it's not what you think, because it isn't what you think, it's when you think. If we can think about what are the things that are coinciding in a learner's experience, then we start to have some influence over what they're focusing on. And that's as much as we can do a lot of the time. And in influencing that, you are, of course, all living up to your responsibility, which is passing that whole body of knowledge of the human race onto the next generation of learners, because that's what we need more than anything else in the world right now, I think. So as a trustee, I'm very, very grateful, and on behalf of all the Board of Trustees, so grateful to you all for all the tremendous work that you do and the things that are not ideal that you put up with in order to keep the learners in the focus of what you're doing. And we're very, very grateful to all of you for doing that. So thank you. If you go to this website, it is a website, cpd.works, you'll find links to the presentation, which I think you've got anyway on Firefly, but you'll find a PDF of that. You'll find a lot of links to things like neuroscience articles, research, a couple of YouTube channels, useful resources that you might find interesting. Otherwise, thank you so much for choosing to spend this time with me today and at the conference, and investing in what's good for you and also what's going to help the learners. And as a trustee personally, thank you all so much for investing the time and the effort that you have done today in making this learning environment more wonderful for both you and for the learners and for everybody in it. So thank you very much. Well done.